October 27, 1825. The Seneca chief approaches the city of Rochester. Suddenly, a voice rings out. "Who comes there?" "Your brothers from the west, on the waters of the Great Lakes." "By what means have they been diverted so far from their natural course?" "Through the channel of the Erie Canal." "By whose authority and by whom was a work of such magnitude accomplished?" "By the authority and enterprise of the people of New York." Near the end of the Ice Age, the first humans appeared into what we now know as New York. They were called the Clovis people. They were believed to have trekked from either Northeast Asia or Central Europe over a pedestrian land route called the Bering Land Bridge. Over the ensuing thousands of years, the Clovis people were replaced by the Lamocas, a native word meaning mud lake. They lived near Juanita and Lamoka Lake in Schuyler County. They were believed to have been cave dwellers. The Lamocas were replaced by the Hopewell Indians, recognized as master builders of earth mound complexes. Some exist even to this day. Approximately 1,000 years ago, the Iroquois arrived, eventually comprising a confederation of 6 tribes. The most prominent members of this confederation were the Mohawks, known as Keepers of the Eastern Door, the Seneca, the Keepers of the Western Door, and the Onondagas, Keepers of the Central Council. Their leaders included Corn Planter, Handsome Lake, and the great orator, Chief Red Jacket. Red Jacket was the chief of the Wolf clan. He negotiated on behalf of the Seneca with the new United States after the American Revolutionary War, when the Seneca, as British allies, were forced to cede much of their land at the Treaty of Canandaigua. Red Jacket's speech, titled "Religion for the White Man and the Red," has been preserved as an example of his great speaking style. In an appearance before Congress in 1803, Chief Red Jacket said the following: "Brothers, listen to my words. There was a time when our forefathers owned this great land. Their seats extended from the rising to the setting sun. The Great Spirit had made it for the use of Indians. He had created the buffalo, the deer, and other animals for food. He made the bear and the beaver, and their skins served us for clothing. He had caused the earth to produce corn for bread. All this he had done for his red children, because he loved them. But an evil day came upon us. Your forefathers crossed the great waters and landed on this island. Their numbers were small. They found friends and not enemies. They told us they had fled from their own country for fear of wicked men and came here to enjoy their religion. They asked for a small seat. We took pity on them, granted their request, and they sat down amongst us. We gave them corn and meat. They gave us poison in return." The poison Red Jacket was referring to was whiskey. In the 13th century, the great explorers began to arrive in New York. such as Giovanni Verrazzano, who discovered New York Bay, Jacques Cartier, who approached northern New York from the territory he assigned the name Canada, Henry Hudson, who traveled north up the river that would later bear his name, Samuel de Champlain, who explored the northeastern region of the area now called New York and discovered his namesake, Lake Champlain. In 1624, the first Dutch settlement was established. The Dutch called it New Netherland. Peter Minuet purchased Manhattan Island for $24 in beads and beaver pelts. In 1664, the British Army conquered New Netherland, which they renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York. In 1754, the French and Indian War began, which changed the course of history. The British and American colonists fought against the French and Canadians, and when the British raised taxes on the colonists to pay for the war, the colonists protested. The rest, as they say, is history. On July 2nd, 1776, colonial congressmen voted to declare independence from England. A young lawyer from Virginia drafted the Declaration of Independence. The United States of America was born. That same year, after serving as a colony of Great Britain for over a century, New York declared its independence and became one of the original 13 states. Born in Windsor, Connecticut, Oliver Phelps accumulated his fortune as a tavern keeper when he entered into what would become known as the Phelps-Gorham land purchase. Many considered him to be the largest landowner in the country. He later moved to Canandaigua, New York, where he opened a grist mill. Nathaniel Gorham came from Massachusetts. He eventually pursued a political career. In 1788, Nathaniel Gorham, along with Phelps, entered into the purchase of 6 million acres of Indian land in western New York. This piece of land stretched from the Pennsylvania border in the south to the southern border of Lake Ontario in the north, and from the Genesee River in western New York to Seneca Lake in the east. The transaction had a value of approximately $30,000, or about 1/2 of a penny per acre. Of the 6 million acres, Phelps and Gorham sold 2.6 million acres of land to settlers. Unfortunately, a great devaluation of property in general soon occurred, which put Gorham and Phelps in dire financial straits. Both died virtually penniless. Phelps died in debtor's prison and is buried at the Pioneer Cemetery in Canandaigua. His home was maintained and continues to stand on Main Street as the Oliver Phelps Country Inn. Gorham also suffered insolvency, which led to his fall from high society and political esteem. Around the time of the Revolutionary War in 1792, a syndicate of Dutch land investors started the Holland Land Company. They purchased the western 2/3 of the Phelps-Gorham lands, about 3 million acres, and a man by the name of Robert Morris brokered this transaction. Morris at that time was considered the richest man in America. He was also known to have personally financed the American Revolution. Before Phelps and Gorham defaulted on their purchase agreement in 1790, they gave a 100-acre tract of land known as the Mill Yard Tract, to Ebenezer Indian Allen, who built a grist mill and a sawmill in an area known as Upper Falls. In March of 1792, with no settlers or land speculators interested in the surrounding land, Indian Allen sold this 100-acre tract to an investor association. In 1803, this association sold the 100 acres for $1,750 under a 5-year land contract to Colonel Nathaniel Rochester. Nathaniel Rochester called this acreage Rochesterville. Later, it was renamed Rochester, New York. The territories of eastern and central New York were now united with the territories of the West. The stage was now set for a series of events that would profoundly change not only the infrastructure of New York State, but also the very character of America itself. As early as 1699, a Frenchman by the name of Sebastien Vauban was considered history's first modern civil engineer, and he suggested the benefits of linking Lakes Erie and Ontario via a series of canals and locks. In 1724, Cadwallader Colden, known as the father of the canal system, for proposing a canal between the Hudson River and the Great Lakes. But perhaps the most colorful of the canal founding fathers was Christopher Coles, who in 1808 proposed building a timber canal. This was essentially a structure that would be built above ground. Coles believed this would solve two problems. First, as a means of building the canal itself, but also as a way of utilizing all the wood from the trees, and there were about 1 million of them, that had to be cut down in its path. Coles was thought by his contemporaries to be ingenious, but sadly, far ahead of his time. Said Coles of his misfortune of being a visionary, "Had I been a hat maker, people would have been born without heads." Robert Fulton, engineer, inventor of the steamboat, and an artist, as early as 1796, wrote a report on the feasibility of a canal in New York and sent it to President George Washington. Fulton was the first to suggest that as a way to pay for the canal's construction, a toll could be levied to its users. It is thought that this became the impetus for the New York Thruway tolls 150 years later. It's also interesting to note that the administration of the Erie Canal today, until recently, was by the New York State Thruway Authority. But the true inspiration for the Erie Canal is believed to have been a Geneva grain merchant by the name of Jesse Hawley. Hawley was hauled away to debtor's prison in 1808, as his business partner had absconded with payments for fees that they both owed on the transportation of goods that they had incurred. During his 18 months of incarceration, Hawley, under the pen name of Hercules, wrote a series of essays which he outlined in remarkable detail the design of the canal, its various construction techniques, its eventual route, and even in estimating the total cost of the canal within 90% of accuracy. All the more remarkable as his essays were written nearly 20 years before the canal's final construction. Upon reading Hawley's essays, William Kirkpatrick and Joshua Foreman, both members of the House of Representatives from New York, approached President Thomas Jefferson, with the idea of the United States funding the project. Jefferson, although agreeing that the project had merit, concluded it might not be accomplished for 100 years. Said Jefferson, "You talk about making a canal of 350 miles through the wilderness? This is nothing short of madness." But over the next 6 years, primarily through the support and leadership of DeWitt Clinton, the then governor of New York, the construction of the Erie Canal would begin. Benjamin Wright assumed the position of chief civil engineer in construction of the canal. He managed thousands of unskilled laborers as they wielded wheelbarrows, hand tools, horses, and mules in the painstaking task of clearing the land. It would take 7 years of backbreaking labor to manually remove buckets of earth in a 363-mile span across the New York wilderness, the longest distance ever attempted in the United States. In 1969, the American Society of Civil Engineers declared Benjamin Wright the father of American civil engineering. The actual construction for the canal began on July 4th, 1817, in Rome, New York. Workers dug the middle section of the canal first. The reason for beginning in the middle was to avoid conflicts between those at either end of the canal for insisting that they be next. It was also thought that this would deter canal opposers to interfere with the work in progress. At the time of its completion, the Erie Canal had become the longest artificial waterway in the United States. Its dimensions were 363 miles long, 43 feet wide at the surface, 28 feet wide at the bottom, with a depth of 4 feet. It had 83 locks. The largest boats to pass through the canal averaged in weight at 76 tons. The canal was enlarged twice after its initial construction, once in 1834 to 1862, and again in 1918. The net result of this achievement brought dramatic settlements in and around Western New York. It essentially created the cities of Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. The canal reduced the cost of shipping goods by over 90%. In less than 10 years, the canal's tolls had paid for the entire cost of its construction. It made New York an economic powerhouse, and it would lead to New York's state motto, the Empire State. In the early 1820s, frontier still covered most of Western New York, and the clergy certainly didn't venture out very far due to the difficulty of relying on horseback for travel. By 1830, 6 years after the completion of the Erie Canal, that all changed. A man by the name of Charles G. Finney, born in Connecticut, arrived in upstate New York, preaching personal salvation to sinners that would lead to the spiritual freedom for thousands, and later the political and social freedom for millions. Finney would later call this area of New York the burned over district. Finney devoted his efforts to the conversion of sinners. Finney stressed that in achieving personal salvation, one had to eliminate the evils of mankind. In Finney's estimation, the greatest of these evils was slavery. Finney's revivalism would lay the groundwork for history-changing events, such as the abolitionist movement, the pursuit of the women's rights movement, and the temperance movement. According to Finney, without personal salvation, true freedom was impossible. Noah came before the flood. I have come before the fire. Joseph Smith was born in Sharon, Vermont in 1805. In 1825, the first full year of the Erie Canal's operation, he moved along with his family to Palmyra, New York. At the age of 24, Smith claimed he had discovered a set of golden plates on a hill called Cumorah, located near the family farm. The inscribed messages on the plates became the content of the Book of Mormon. Smith attempted to have the plates transcribed into a book, and this is where the Erie Canal played a surprising and pivotal role. The Erie Canal was monumental in the economic development of Palmyra, New York, and the publication of the Book of Mormon. When Palmyra was designated as a canal stop, the city was given a bright future. During that era, economies boomed that served as canal stops due to their need for businesses like hotels, restaurants, and blacksmiths, which accommodated the travelers and business people. One such business was a bookstore and printing company operated by Egbert Grandin. The canal allowed Grandin to float his equipment and supplies into Palmyra for 90% less than traditional overhand methods. And Joseph Smith was able to use Grandin's printing press to print and publish the Book of Mormon at an acceptable cost. And it changed America. The Mormon religion, founded by Joseph Smith, would become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Today, it claims over 85,000 missionaries and over 15 million members. The Erie Canal was the greatest boon to travel between the Atlantic seaboard and the Great Lakes, facilitating unprecedented economic development and the proliferation of social communication. It became, in effect, to paraphrase Bill Gates nearly 200 years later, the information superhighway of its time. It was also a prominent means of transportation for American fugitive slaves escaping to the north and to Canada. Former slave, orator, and newspaper publisher Frederick Douglass, then living in Rochester, and abolitionist Gerrit Smith from Petersboro in Madison County, New York, would set the stage for the abolition of slavery. Douglass, whose moral authority on slavery was unquestioned, would say, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. There are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without the thunder and lightning." Harriet Tubman, abolitionist and also former slave, was known as a conductor of the Underground Railroad because of her use of the Erie Canal to ferry runaway slaves to Canada. Said Tubman, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Following the success of the abolitionist movement, many of its earliest supporters, who were white women, the women's rights movement began. Movement leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, summed up the movement's philosophy when she exclaimed, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." And Susan B. Anthony, who said, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." But it would be another former slave, whose slave name was Lizzie Bomfrey, but then who changed her name to Sojourner Truth, who would bridge the divide between the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. In 1851, she delivered a speech in Dayton, Ohio, before a group of suffragettes. Concerned that a black woman, an abolitionist, was about to speak at a convention they felt should be reserved solely for discussing women's issues, the crowd began to audibly voice its disapproval. Hearing the mutterings of the audience as she made her way to the podium, Sojourner Truth would deliver not only one of the most memorable speeches of the women's movement, perhaps of all of American history. Sojourner Truth spoke. "Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arms. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman?" The women's suffrage movement learned during their abolitionist work how to create support networks, how to organize, how to make social and political statements. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, strategically located with access to the Erie Canal, would begin this fight for basic human rights and lead to women's right to vote. So what did Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Charles Finney, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman have in common? New York was their home, and the Erie Canal their means of transportation. And they changed America. Were Christopher Coles, Robert Fulton, Jesse Hawley psychics? Indeed, these people did possess great mental and spiritual acuity. They conceived of ideas just as astounding as any paranormal communication with anyone or anything not readily of this world. In fact, spiritualists seem to have a much easier time contacting spirits than the forefathers of the Erie Canal did in selling the project to mortal men and bringing it to fruition and its final glorious completion. So here's the takeaway. The Erie Canal delivered people to important places for important reasons. This powerful waterway carried a flotilla of radicals, visionaries, social reformers, and prophets bent on the idea of creating a new society. Because of the Erie Canal, New York State didn't simply eke its way into historic transformation. It exploded into the 19th century in ways that galvanized all aspects of life. It was a time of intense individual focus and enlightened change in the ways in which people communicated. It was as if a bolt of electricity struck Western New York, lighting it up as fertile ground for ideas and lifestyles that had never been expressed or attempted before. It was a time of religious rebirth, ongoing social reform, and making one's life the best it could be in the present, in the future, and even in the great beyond. And it changed America.